CSS has been getting so many great features lately. However, one of the things it's not that good at yet is staggered animations, or animations where every child of the animation is delayed just with a little offset. Such animation you can, for example, see on the marketing page for the Framer Motion course I'm working on. If you look at this code editor, you see every letter appear one by one, or said otherwise, every letter has a small delay after the previous one. And doing that in CSS is not fun at all. You need to work, for example, with the end selector or NTH selector. So I started doing this in CSS at first, but there were so many issues with this that I thought this is a really great opportunity to show what Framer Motion can do with these staggered animations. Because doing this in CSS gave me a lot of issues. One of the things that's, for example, pretty much impossible is to wait before I repeat the same animation until each and every letter is finished. I would need to, for example, create a CSS variable that sets a custom... No, even that wouldn't work. You see, I'm getting confused while trying to explain this to you, simply because if you create an animation with CSS, it's impossible to set a delay before you repeat it again. Then I need to, for example, remove the animation, and then with JavaScript add it back once the duration has been completed, weird things like this. And that's just the hassle that CSS still has if you're working with staggered animations. So in today's video, we'll be looking at how we can build this with Framer Motion, and we're actually be looking at two of these animations. The first one is this typing animation where you just see the letters appear one by one, but I'm, for example, also gonna take a look at how you can, for example, create this heading animation that just as soon as you scroll into view, fades in all the letters one by one. And of course, the animation is fully customizable. So let's start building right away. If you're new here, my name is Jeroen and you are watching Frontend FYI. After over a decade working as a professional front-end developer and teaching other people on my team, I decided it's now time to start teaching a wider audience the craft in front-end engineering. And that's why I started Frontend FYI. I hope you enjoyed today's video. As a starting point of today's video, I created a very basic Vite project where we already have a very big text telling us to scroll down. And as soon as we do that, we see the word hello appear. Now, what I want to achieve first is making sure that we fade in the letters one by one. The first thing that's important to notice is that I already created a component called animated text. This animated text component has two properties. The first one is the text prop, and the second one is a class name. So this text is just dynamic, so we can create any text we want and perhaps even add multiple words in there. And the class name, of course, helps us so we can style this the way we want. If we scroll down to our text component, you also see that it accepts an element prop, or L in short, and that's simply any valid HTML node like paragraph or a specific heading or a span, so we can also decide what type of element it should be. But that's just so you can use it in as many places as you want. In order to animate the letters one by one, the first thing we have to do is split the word in each and every letter. I'm gonna add another text in here because I want to wrap the first version into a class name that has screen reader only. And then we're gonna move this text in there. So that way we have a specific version that's for screen readers. So screen readers will still see the full word without it being broken up in different spans, for example, which could mess up what the screen reader reads out. So that means that the second version we're also gonna wrap inside of a span. And then we're gonna add area hidden. So the second version is not read to the screen reader, but the first one will be. And as for the visibility of the user, it's actually exactly the other way around. You aren't able to see this visually, but you are able to see this. So what we're gonna do with this is we're actually gonna split this based on nothing. So that means that we split on each and every character. And then we got a character which we could map. And then, for example, also render as a character inside the span for now. And that will still give us the exact same result. So let's go ahead and first import motion from Framer Motion, which I of course already installed. And then we're gonna change this span into a motion.span. And then we are already able to let this animate by, for example, setting initial opacity 0 and then adding animate opacity 1. And if you then refresh, you see that there is a quick fade in animation happening. So we can make very basic animations with this as well, but we could already do that with CSS. So let's start adding some of the staggering as well. First, we're gonna change this span into a motion.span as well. So what we're gonna do is we are gonna remove the initial as well as the animate property, and we're gonna make a custom object here, which we, for example, call default animations. And I'm adding the default here because I want our animations to have a default that we're also able to override later. So we're gonna add two properties in here. The first one is hidden, where we add the opacity 0 back, and the second one is visible, where we're adding opacity 1. Then we can copy these default animations and go back to our individual character span and add a variance property. In there, we set our default animations. Then we are going to our parent span that wraps all of them, and we're gonna add initial. And instead of adding an animation in here, we're actually gonna use the name of our animation that we have defined up here, which is hidden. And then for animate, we're gonna say visible. And by adding this, we're telling our parent that by default it's in the state hidden, and that immediately after it loads, it should animate to the state visible. And the way framer motion works is that every child motion element that's inside a parent will inherit the state of these initial and animate properties if it doesn't define one itself. So that means if we refresh, everything is still fading in. However, now we are using these named animations and controlling the state from the parent, we can add a property called transition. And in that transition property, we can define a property called staggered children, and for example, add in there 0.1. And if we then go back to our hello and we refresh, we see that all of them fade in one by one. And yes, we did need some JavaScript now to get this to work. However, we can really easily control the way this works now. And we can also, of course, make this way more crazy. You could even add a property y of 20 pixels, and when it's visible, y becomes 0. And if you do that, nothing works. And that is because our span is by default display inline. So that means that we need to add a class name, make it inline block. And if you do that and refresh, you also see that the transition works and that the letters now also animate up. And that's super cool, right? And it's pretty easy to set up, especially now because if you look at the integration of our component, you can just reuse this component over and over and it will work each and every time. However, if you're on the top of the page and you load the page and then go down, there's nothing you see because the page has already loaded and the animation fired right away. So there's another cool thing you can add with framer motion, and that is also listen to when this element comes into view. So I suggest we'll add that next. If we go back to our component, we first need to create a ref, which is just a useRef from React, which we initialize as null. And then we are also going to use framer's inViewHook. So we define a variable called isInView, and for that we use the useInViewHook, which also comes from framer motion, which we need to pass that ref. And that ref we then need to attach to the element that we want to know if it's in view or not. So let's add the ref to our main word so we can test if that's visible or not. I'm also gonna add a second object to the inView where I'm gonna add the amount property and set that to 0.5. That means that at least half of the element should be in view before the element triggers. Because if it's just one pixel in view and it starts animating already, you might still miss it. Now, the easiest way to use this inView boolean is just change the animate property based on whether it is in view or not. So let's add that variable in there. And then we're going to say if it's in view, it should be visible, and otherwise it will be hidden. And if we do that and just refresh to be sure, and then scroll down, you see that the text fades in only as soon as it gets into view. And perhaps you think, I don't want this to repeat over and over because that's ugly. I just want it once and then that's it. Well, you're gonna add a once boolean and then it will fade in once. But if you then scroll away and come back, it won't fade in anymore. That's all up to you, depending on what you want. And I would even advise, let's just add a once property to our animated text props, so we can decide based on every animated text if we want it once or if we want it to repeat over and over. So that means that we're gonna add that once boolean on here. Then we get the once inside of our animated text, and we're gonna define that into our hook. So that way, right now, it's always false. But if we would add it onto our component here as once, we refresh, scroll away, and then it won't animate anymore. So that way we are fully in control. And of course, as for the animation, you can completely tweak it yourself. If you, for example, want to have that code editor that adds every letter one by one, you just add a small opacity fade and that's it maybe. You can even go in here and add a transition property where you can say duration of, for example, 0.1. And then it's a lot quicker than, for example, if you would add a 1 on here. Then everything is way slower. So that way you can completely control the animation. And I will even link the playground down below where I actually make the animation configurable via a prop onto this component as well. But that's just too much for this video. There's two more things that I still want to do. And that is first make sure that it also works with multiple words and that it keeps the words together. Because if we, for example, would write hello everybody, then you see that it does two things. First, the space is gone, and secondly, it cuts it off wherever it wants. And if you're using this for a page title, of course, that's not too pretty. And there's two reasons this is happening. The first one is because every letter is individually inside a span. It thinks the priority to break it up is equal for each and every letter, so it just decides to do whatever it wants. So the first thing we have to do is wrap every word inside of a span. So let's go ahead and split the text based on a space. So we can split every word. And then, of course, we should split the word on every character. And then it's still the same, but that is because our span is by default display inline. So as soon as we now make this inline block as well, it starts breaking the lines at the right position for every word. However, if we now inspect this too, then we notice that the space at the end of our word isn't there. And that is because we break on that space, so we kind of lose that. This also means that we need to add a space after each and every word. For that, we can just render an empty span that's also inline block, in which we just render the space. And that then renders an empty space character. So that means that if we convert this, for example, into hello you, that the space is preserved and it's also the correct sizing based on the font size. And now we have multiple words. It's a pretty small step to also go towards multi-line. Because what we still need to do is make sure that we update our types here. So it doesn't only accept a string, but it also accepts an array of strings. And then we can uncomment my second line here. And then, of course, we should make sure that we split on the right things. So the first step is, instead of taking the text in, we're gonna create a text array where we're gonna say if it is an array, then we're fine. Otherwise, we put that text string into an array, so we always are working with an array. And then we can simply take our text array and then we map over it. So we have a text line. And that text line, we then also just wrap inside of a span. But this time we're gonna add class name of block on here. So the line is display block, which means that it pushes each and every line to a new line instead of right behind each other. And then we're gonna take this line, and that's what we're gonna use to split on a space. And if we then scroll to the very last one, you see that each and every line animates one by one, word by word, letter by letter. And of course, this looks really ugly because it's super slow. But you get the point. You can simply create now multi-line animations And then just make sure that we add this animation, for example, to 0.1. And then you see almost like a typewriter, that just everything appears one by one. And that's super cool, because this would be horrible to create with CSS, especially if at the end we would want it to loop again. And that looping is the very last thing I want to add, because then we're diving into another really cool feature of Framer Motion, and that is animation controls, where we can stop, reverse, switch to a different animation, all with a very small function. And again, that's something that's really hard to achieve with plain CSS. So there's a few things that are involved with this. The first one is that we're gonna create const controls is use animation. And that use animation is also imported from Framer Motion. And then we can use these controls to add to our animate property. And then instead of using the in view inside the animate, we are going to use a use effect. And inside that effect, we're going to respond to a change in the is in view boolean. So we're going to say there, if, well, Copilot already guesses it. If it's in view, we're gonna set it to visible, and otherwise, come on Copilot, we're gonna set this to hidden. So now it should still all be the same. Yes, it animates, this one animates as well. But now we have these two functions, we can simply use a timeout to set it to hidden for a second and then just start all over again by setting it to visible. I'm actually gonna make a function called show. And to start with, that just runs the start visible. However, we're also gonna create a let timeout, which is a Node.js timeout. And then in here, we're gonna run yes Copilot, and then just for example, set it to 1000 milliseconds for now. And then my light went out, but hopefully you also saw that the text already disappeared because that timeout is run, of course. But we did not set it again, so we also need to add the set it to visible again, so it just appears again. However, before we set it to visible, we need to wait until the hidden is completed. So let's quickly add an async on there as well, and then we await until the hidden is completed. But it's animating away now, which is probably not what we want, but it's doing that because we add the staggered children on here. However, if it now removes all of the letters, you already see that it's also running this staggered children. So instead of adding it as a transition, we actually need to define variants on here as well, and just define it as empty as possible, which means we have visible as well as hidden. Hidden can stay empty, but for visible, we're gonna add the transition property on here, and then we're gonna say staggered children of 0.1. If we then remove this, the hiding is instant, and then again you see that it simply starts all over again. However, we've now added 1 second as a delay, but we need to make sure that the full animation is finished before we can restart that animation. You could count each and every letter inside of the text and then just multiply it with the duration of the animation, and then you're good to go. However, I think creating animations is such a manual process always, and you might even want to add a specific delay after the animation is finished before you restart it again, that instead of calculating this number, I actually want to add another prop to this component so we are total in control. So let's go ahead and go to our time definition, and we're gonna add a property repeat delay, and that's a number, and that's also optional. So we can get that from our props here, repeat delay, and then we can add this number on top of our set timeout. However, we can also wrap it inside of an if statement. So if we don't have this repeat delay, we won't repeat. The final thing we also still need to do is return our clear timeout here. So if there is a timeout and the effect runs again, that we make sure that we clean everything up so it won't start multiple timeouts that in the end will ruin the animation, because things will be set multiple times to visible and hidden and everything will just be one big mess. So that means that by default now this animation won't repeat itself, because we did not set a repeat delay. But if we now go back to this component and set a repeat delay of, for example, 10,000 milliseconds, and we refresh, then it will type everything, tick, tick, tock, tock. Then it will wait a little bit. Then everything should be gone. and then it will start all over again. And this way you have a fully repeating typing animation, just like I created in the bento cards on my website. And if we go back to the other one, you see that it fades in still once, and then stays in place. There's no repetition, nothing. And you have a component that you can use in multiple places to create different types of animations with letters. And that sums up today's video. I think that things like this show that there is still a need for framer motion, or at least that CSS has a few things to gain still. Because CSS has become super powerful lately, but there's just a few things that JavaScript can still do just a little bit better, easier, more configurable, things like that. But I think CSS is catching up really fast to libraries like Framer Motion. Like I said before, make sure to click the link down below as well, because there you see the live playground, and I also added a variation on there where you can configure the animation based with props as well, so you can create different animations with the same component again. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, leave a like and subscribe to this channel because there's a lot more coming. And if you're curious about that Framer course that I showed in the beginning, that marketing page will be up soon on frontend.fyi, and it also won't take too long anymore before that course is released as part of the Pro subscription. If you're interested in that, definitely check out frontend.fyi as well, or subscribe to the newsletter to know when that marketing page is launched. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.